As you probably know, back in the spring, we started this series, and we had a number of individual collectors here who talked about their passion for collecting artwork and what criteria they used for forming their own personal collections. And in this fall, we moved on to institutional collecting. And so we're going to have a series of talks that look at some of our nation's great museums and how part of their collections, or in certain cases their entire collections, came together and the people who made it happen. So what better place to start than the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Not that I'm biased or anything. So in that context, we're very fortunate tonight to have Dr. Helen Evans here, who was indeed instrumental in creating, building, expanding the collection of Byzantine art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I continue to be shocked when I say this, but the Michael and Catherine, is that the title? Mary and Michael Jaharis galleries of Byzantine art, which Dr. Evans installed originally in the year 2000 and then expanded and completely reinstalled in 2008, were the first gallery dedicated solely to Byzantine art in a major international museum. And again, I'm shocked when I say that, being that Byzantine was my unrelated field of study, and how could you not have one until 2000? But that's a different topic. So Dr. Evans is now the Mary and Michael Jaharis Curator of Byzantine Art, and her career with the Metropolitan Museum of Art goes back to the mid-1980s, when she started as an intern, a research fellow, and a curator, sabbatical replacement, and then became intern, assistant curator, associate curator, and full endowed curator since 1999. Prior to that, Dr. Evans had studied at the Institute of Fine Arts, where she got both her master's and her PhD, with a dissertation in Armenian illuminated manuscripts. And in that field, she had contributed to, or she'd been the curator of the one of the curators of the Armenian manuscript exhibit at the Morgan. Now, at the Metropolitan, some of her exhibitions have really been page-turners, as far as I'm concerned, in the history of exhibitions in this country. Her Glory of Byzantium from 1997, followed by Byzantium, Faith and Power in 2004, and most recently Byzantium and Islam, Age of Transition from 2012, two of which were named major cultural events by the mighty New York Times, and then among the top shows of their respective years by Apollo magazine. She has lectured and published widely on the cross-cultural currents in the development of Christian art, its style and iconography. There's plenty of chairs up front. Don't be shy. And has chaired the editorial board of the Art Bulletin, co-founder of the American Association of Art Museum Curators, and board member of the International Center for Medieval Art. And I also want to add, on a personal note, I've known Dr. Evans since I was in graduate school, and she was not only an inspiration for me and a mentor when we were trying to get Mobia started in New York, but has been a supporter and a friend ever since. So I am extremely pleased to welcome her to Winter Park and our continuing summer. And she will be talking tonight on curators, collectors, ideas, creating a collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Please help me welcome Dr. Helen Evans.
Thank you very much for having me here. I've never been to this museum before, so I've had a great deal of fun this afternoon looking at your collection and your rather fascinating temporary exhibitions that are up now. Many, and apparently this is what you all learned about last year, was the history of collections from the point of view of one collector. And I think we often forget how often collections begin with one person or one group of people and then expand over time. And as they expand over time, they reflect the changing ideas of what we're interested in, what we want to know about cultures, and what we want to know about art. So I am actually the curator of the culmination of works of art collected since approximately 1870, when the Met was founded, related to the world that we call Byzantium, whose inhabitants would have told you quite proudly they were the Romans. It is the empire that is ruled from roughly 300 to the middle of the 15th century, from the polis, the city of Constantine the Great, the New Rome he founded when he moved the imperial Roman capital to a region closer to the border areas that needed defense, and what is arguably the first Christian city, the great church at the heart of the city was a Christian church, which would not be true of other cities like Rome in Italy, old Rome, for several more centuries. So my Romans, your Byzantines, who included ultimately Romania, where Enna is from, are the Eastern Mediterranean. And if you want to think of where the territories are that we will be looking at tonight, it's pretty much where everybody is fighting right now. So from Libya to Egypt, up through Syria, Turkey. They're not fighting this week in Russia, but Russia is not lending to American museums. And then the Balkans and a little bit of the Italian peninsula and at one time parts of Spain. It was a continuation of the Roman Empire. And what was particularly important to the founders of the Met, is this going to move it forward? Yes, was its role in the origins of Christianity. And as we look tonight, we're going to look particularly at two collectors who have had the most immense, profound impact. And one is everybody's favorite financier of the beginning of the 20th century, J. Pierpont Morgan, whose collections affected much of the Met's collections, but are actually totally central to the collections of Western medieval art and Byzantine art. And so he is represented by this piece we'll come back to, an image of the Virgin Mary praying, which we used as the banner for the opening of the Mary and Michael Jaharis galleries in the year 2000. What interested Morgan did not interest the Jaharises in the same way, but the works of art moved on between them. And from the beginning, the first generation of interest at the Met was in how Christianity gained a visual voice, which occurs in the first centuries of the Common Era, late Roman, early Byzantine, and the turn of the 20th century is when academic scholarship is particularly focused on what were the first Christian images, why were they used, who used them, where did they come from? And the Met took part in that debate. So by 1877, we have this handsome sculpture of Jonah being thrown off the ship into the whale and coming out of the whale and being saved. And we didn't buy it as gorgeous sculpture. We bought it because it came from Tarsus, the city in which Paul has his vision that makes him one of the leaders of the early church. And so we thought we were acquiring the beginning. And we were also interested in Jerusalem. So this, one of our earliest of these flasks, we actually own a number of them, is the beginning of our trying to acquire things that would have been made in the city of Christ, crucifixion, the city of the Wailing Wall, central to two of the great religions that are covered in my galleries. This one, you can't tell it, but this is a menorah. The others of these, those are crosses, and it requires laying a piece of paper across them and rubbing it to guess which one it is. It takes real talent to make a menorah and a cross look like the same thing, and they achieved it. In Jerusalem in the 7th century. And here, one of our least attractive, but genuinely one of the most important works in the museum's collection. It is the base of a bowl where the edges, the rim has been clipped away. It was placed in a funerary context in the city of Rome. The inscription is in Latin, but as you can see from this very clear menorah, you have one of the earliest examples of the beginning of the modern voice of Judaism, in which the menorah was a very steady symbol. So by 1900, the teens, we're looking very hard at the origins of the Christian world's imagery. We don't particularly care that it was done by people who lived in the East and were ruled from Constantinople, but we want to know the voice of Christianity. The other thing that we want to know is how to acquire a large number of very beautiful objects. And that was where Mr. Morgan was at his greatest strength. He bought and bought and bought some more, and we in the United States benefited immensely from the kind of omnivorous eating up of great art objects that Morgan did. He acquired many things from France. He was very much a Francophile. And among them was a whole body of works coming out of French cathedrals that were actually made in the Christian East and almost certainly brought to France in the 13th century with the Fourth Crusade. So we have this panel with the crucifixion that maybe in Western Europe was attached to a book cover. They often were, and that would explain these nail holes. We did not acquire it for what it was, which is an icon, a work for religious devotion. You have it, it's a small object, you have it in your home, you look at it, you think about his sacrifice and how you should live better. We acquired it because it's exquisitely carved. It was the type of work that an elegant Frenchman would like in their home, that Mr. Morgan would like in his home, just like this chest that also came from a French religious setting, leading people to think that the Byzantines weren't very bright because they didn't know that little putti running around, and this actually has Dionysus on the top, were not Christian, which in fact is actually that the Crusaders didn't know that this came from your living room and was good interior decoration, and this came from your church or from your private chapel. The confusion went the other way. It would not really be worked out until the 20th century. And Mr. Morgan, never to buy in only one place, bought a large number of things from Russia. And among the most important are these rondelles worked in cloisonné enamel. They're called the Jamati enamels. They are supposed to have come from the Republic of Georgia through a collector in St. Petersburg to the Met. And there is Mary, we'll see her again, with John the Baptist and Christ, the deists, the representatives of humanity praying to Christ on mankind's behalf in the Orthodox world. These pieces, all of these, were not displayed as something of another culture. They were in the galleries of European sculpture and decorative arts, the origins of essentially French Gothic, and they were seen for their aesthetic beauty. Nobody particularly cared, beyond saying this is Christ and these are putti, nobody cared what they meant in the context of the society that created them. Instead, the real excitement was that Morgan could buy these origins of Western art, and the most important of those that he bought were the David plates, and this is the largest of the plates. They were discovered in the late 1800s. Morgan never liked anything that was dirty, so after they were dug up from a harbor in northern Cyprus where they had been hidden for more than a millennium, they were polished for several years in Paris and restored to a beautiful state, and Morgan paid a fortune for them when he acquired them, and they were in all the magazines. It was an incredibly exciting thing, and you can just look at the exquisite workmanship and recognize how one would say this is classical antiquity, still alive, and that's what's important. And if you actually like them, if you go to www.metmuseum.org and look at 82nd and 5th, a thing we have in which curators get to babble, I babbled on it, and you can look at incredible details of these plates. They are just fantastic because we think they might have been now, as we study them, something that you put on your dinner table, and after an evening of a certain amount of wine, you took part in telling the story of David and Goliath, reenacting it for the other dinner guests. And so you would want it to be perfectly made because you would all be looking at it. Mr. Morgan loved bling. One can never underestimate his enthusiasm for bling. And these are about as bling as the medieval department at the Met can give you. It's a pair of bracelets, so we would have worn them like two cuffs. And if you're interested in the world that kind of made them, if you'll look at this year's Dolce & Gabbana fashion things, he did everything on Byzantium. And they're there. Yeah, really. The inside is such incredibly elegant pierced gold that in other pieces that's the exterior. But on these you add the greatest enthusiasm of the Byzantine world, pearls, and then jewels which are in various ways protective and amuletic as well as gorgeous. What's fascinating about these pieces, and leads my lecture on, is that Mr. Morgan bought these the way I buy postcards when he was on a trip on the Nile on his boat, the Karga, which is a site that the Metropolitan Museum of Art dug at the beginning of the 20th century. Morgan was a trustee, and then he was the chairman of the board of the museum, and he underwrote much of what we did in Egypt. He was not interested in the pharaonic art that our curators cared about. What he was interested in was proving that the Bible was truth. Schliemann has just proved around 1900 that Troy is real, Homer was real. The events of Homer are real. Whether or not that stands up, that's what everybody thought in 1900. And if that was true, was the Bible real? This is an obsession that goes across the Christian world. And it, of course, is anchored in the area in which the biblical events occurred. So Egypt, with the crossing of the Red Seas, the Moses story, the Christ child being taken into Egypt, is a particularly important place for looking for the reality of both the old and the new portions of the Bible. And Morgan, as a very good Episcopalian, demanded that when our Egyptian archaeologists went out to the digs like at Karga, and here you see Mr. Morgan in a fantastic view of his rear end, going to Karga. He demanded that they dig and record the Christian level. And one of the things that early Christian monks did was to go out and overcome demons. And where can you find better demons than in these pharaonic ruins of ancient Egypt? So there's often kind of a monastic, not an elegant monastic setting, but kind of a rude one on top. And what we dug was the garbage cans. We dug piles and piles of garbage cans. They're filled with incredible information. We got the bracelets from a dealer in Cairo. And then Morgan required that that level that was dug, not only that it be recorded, but that we send the architects that worked on the digs to record all the Christian monasteries existing in Egypt in his lifetime. So this bulletin of the museum shows you the interior of a church at Wadi Natrun, and it doesn't take much to guess that we're looking for the origins of Gothic art. You can see the pointed arches. What everyone is looking for, Egyptologists I know say that Egyptology in general is driven by the desire to find the Pharaoh that connected to Moses. We want to know a historical truth. And as this late 19th century obsession, which the Met participated in but in no way led, occurred, one of the things that was discovered were vast funeral sites for a Christian level. And we tend to call it Coptic, and I will spare you my entire diatribe over why Coptic is not totally correct. But what happened was you found these bodies that had not been preserved as the pharaonic burials had, but they had been preserved to a degree, dressed in nice clothing, and then wrapped in layers and layers of increasingly potentially worn out clothing and domestic furnishings, and buried in the sand where they did not decay because the sand was dry. And as you dug these up, it became the hottest thing in town. All of you would have been collecting these textiles. It was what anybody who was anyone was doing in the 1880s. And the Met was able to get people to buy these textiles at public subscriptions. So I would have been here asking you all to give me money to buy these textiles from Egypt. And we thought that they would be examples of Christianity, which we'll see in a moment is untrue. But what we did have was in the Metropolitan Museum, a very large gallery. All of this is material from the Byzantine period in Egypt, what we tend to call Coptic. It was a very big thing. It's a very big room. This room plus at least one of the others beyond it. We'd forgotten it totally when I came to the museum. I had an Institute of Fine Arts graduate student doing research in our archives, and Lyle Humphrey is the reason we have these photographs unearthed. And when you come to the Met on your next visit, you'll see that these stones are now hanging in my galleries, and many of these textiles are there. And here are a few of them. Public subscription, but also a few major collectors. And one was George F. Baker, who in 1890 gave us these two pieces and a number of other works. He was a friend of Mr. Morgan's. He bought all of his pieces from the director of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Hopefully not that he shouldn't have. He bought pieces that were exceptionally beautiful and incredibly well preserved. What he didn't buy was pieces that we know much about where they actually came from. We know they're, at least in theory, dug up in Egypt. So here you have one of the very few pieces with a Christian theme in our collection. We have about 3,000 textiles from this period in Egypt, and there are less than 20 of them that have Christian themes. What they've got is good taste. What's up here? But first, you've got the Christ child, and really wide-eyed animals. And if it makes you think of the Wiener Werkstatt in Austria at that time, it should, because they are also collecting these textiles. Their patrons are collecting these textiles. They're being collected in Russia. They're being collected in London. They are being studied by an immense number of people, including Matisse. They have an effect that we don't often think of. At the time, we're still at the Met more interested in pieces like this, which one of our early directors published as the first image of a Christian saint. It's got a halo. It's also got earrings, a diadem, therefore probably at best a female saint, and a cloth full of flowers, and it's almost certainly a personification of either abundance or spring. But we wanted to find Christianity, and we would make it Christian whether it actually worked or not. We also wanted the best pieces to be from the period of the Roman rule of the area. So this, which is about 8 feet tall, and is actually a curtain that would have hung across a door like the one under the exit sign, was always considered to be a work of the 6th century, a work that would go with Byzantine rule. When we showed it in Byzantium and Islam, for the first time, we had technical analysis of it done. And what it shows is, as we'll see again in a few minutes, the first generation of Islamic rule in this region wanted to look like everybody else who was proper and affluent and lived with good taste. And so this is actually woven in the Islamic period. Whether it was woven for a Christian who remained affluent, or woven for the first generation of Muslims, many of whom had actually served in the Byzantine army, is something we will continue to search. But what I love about it is it hung up here. These are mounted warriors fighting, so it's auspicious, it's protecting you. It was swung back, and you can see where it was swung back enough times that the fabric wears a hole. And this was the edge that leaned into the door, so enough people brushed against it to wear out the fabric right here. You can kind of see it living. And if you look at the mosaics in Ravenna, Italy, that go from roughly a century before this, you see a curtain just like this on the palace in Santa Paula Nuova. The people that go are Morgan and his friends, but it doesn't end with them. everybody who's anybody goes to Egypt. You prefer to go in the Christmas season when the weather is warm. And this is just one of my favorite photographs. This is the Havemeyer ladies. They are there with Dikran Kalekian, who is one of the major dealers in Islamic, ancient Near Eastern, Armenian, since he's an Armenian from Turkey, and Byzantine art. So these things aren't collected by people who are only focusing on this world, because as many of you know, the Havemeyers have their home in New York City done by Tiffany, and as friends of Mary Cassatt, they provide the Met with an exceptional collection of Impressionist paintings, because she tells them exactly who they should be buying from, because all the artists that are important in the Impressionist movement are her friends. And Kalekian was one of her friends too. Kalekian had a number of portraits done of his family by Cassatt that hang in his granddaughter's home. And in fact, our last major extension of our collection of this fabrics from Egypt is when Nanette Kalekian a few years ago gave us everything left in her grandfather's storage rooms as she closed down the very last of his business. There is no major collection in the world that does not have Kalekian's pieces. And his interest in his own origins in the Eastern Mediterranean adds to the sophistication he brings to his dealings as a dealer first in Paris and then New York. So the collectors are forged by both their own interests, by the knowledge of the dealers, by the curators they are talking to, and by the evolution of events. So by 1931, the Met suddenly discovers icons. We have in 31 an exhibition that you see on this bulletin of Russian icons, largely connected to the social and political upheavals in what became the Soviet bloc and the Bolshevik Revolution, and its throwing out of Christianity and the dispersal of that material beyond the borders of what had once been the territories of the Tsar. We don't buy them because we care about what you do with them if you are a believer in Orthodox Christianity. We buy them, to the extent that we bought any, which wasn't much, because it's being argued that they are part of the origins of contemporary art. They are a way to think of dealing with planes of color. You can particularly see the background and the foreground here, so just simple planes rather than the realism of the Renaissance which the camera is displacing. And that has to be the reason that we, in the Met, own the icon on the right. It was given to us in 1931 by Lily P. Bliss. And if any of you are interested in contemporary art, Lily Bliss is one of the founders of the Museum of Modern Art. She is buying it not because of a religious interest, but because of the type of materials that one could use to show what legitimizes modern art from its past. In the same year, in 31, we participated as a museum intellectually, but not with any loans, with the first international exhibition on Byzantine art that was held in the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris. So Byzantine art as elegant decoration, not Byzantine art in terms of its cultural or its meaning. And James Beck, who was our associate director, was particularly important in bringing that exhibition together. Matisse was one of the chairmen of it. A number of contemporary artists were involved in it. And we became increasingly interested in the capital of Byzantium, Constantinople. Constantinople is the capital of the Ottoman Empire from the mid-15th century until the Turkish Revolution. So in the 1920s, when you have the dispersal of people in that area, Constantinople, Istanbul, the Greek corruption of to the city, is still Turkish, Muslim, not really accessible for studying its ancient Christian monuments. When Ataturk is made the head of the republic, moves the capital to Ankara, one of the first things that he agrees to do, in part to please his supporters in the Western world, is he turns the Church of Hagia Sophia, which is 3 times taller than the highest Gothic cathedral, built in the 6th century by the Emperor Justinian. From the arrival of Mehmet the Conqueror until Ataturk, the victory mosque of the Ottoman Empire, Ataturk makes it a museum. It is still being fought over today. And one of the things he does when he makes it a museum is to allow Thomas Whittemore of the Byzantine Institute to go into the building and to start uncovering the mosaics that we know are there from a 19th century restoration under the Ottomans, but no one has seen for centuries. So whenever you look at a book on the history of Byzantine art now, and there are all these pictures of the interior of Hagia Sophia's mosaics, in 1930 you couldn't have had those pictures. 1944, a year before the Second World War is over, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has an exhibition on art in the Republic of Turkey. Early art and Islamic art are shown from things in our collection, and we bring all these elements of the photographs of uncovering the mosaics, of the mosaics, plaster cast of the mosaics themselves, to New York City. We're doing it, it would appear, largely to say that Turkey should be part of the Western Europe so that we will have a place to put military bases to stop the Russians. But it is presented in the context of an art museum. And it is an incredibly successful exhibition. Ferdinand Léger writes about how these mosaics will be an inspiration for modern art. The most important art historians on Christian topics write about what they mean. They become the basis of every textbook, and one of the pieces remains on display at the Met today. When we have this, which is an exact copy of the Deasis. I showed you the 3 parts from the Jumati enamels, the Virgin and John the Baptist appealing for mankind to Christ, who is in effect in heaven. When we showed it in 44, we showed the photographs of the marble coming off to reveal it. We showed it cleaned. The reviews said that the Turks never took any of the gold away, unlike the evil Crusaders. Very, very funny reviews. And then in my favorite photograph, Mr. Adolph Green is shown as he copies precisely, life-size, St. John the Baptist and actually all the rest of the mosaic. During the war, when the sea lanes were attacked, they took photographs of this mosaic, sent it by ship to MIT, which you would have thought had something else to do during the Second World War, which did full-scale blow-ups, and this is huge. I tried to move it for an exhibition, and it was bigger than the room I wanted to move it into. Took the blown-up copies, shipped them back on the sea lanes to Turkey, and for several years of the war, people like Mr. Green very carefully painted each tesserae and then checked it against the original to show you exactly what it looked like. And then it was approved by the Turkish government. This is the only legally approved copy of the mosaic ever made, and the Metropolitan Museum paid $10,000 for it in 1944. So in 1954, it's still in our galleries. Going backwards. Yeah, sorry. You can see this copy here if you come to look at the Christmas tree. And you go into the gallery with the Christmas tree and you turn around and you look toward Fifth Avenue. And it's high on the wall. And it was put there in a reinstallation of the galleries by Rorimer then a curator, to be the director of the Met, who himself, during the war, becomes one of the monuments men, one of the people that helped return the looted art during the war. And George Clooney, I think, is playing Rorimer in the movie that's about to come out about this. But Rorimer at the Met reinstalled all the galleries, kept the Giamatti enamels, and did them very much the way that our pieces had been installed in the beginning. Beautiful objects that related to the origins of Western European art, particularly French Gothic. The pieces that we looked at that came out of Egypt increasingly get put in storage. Academics have gotten tired of looking for where Jesus actually was. Museums have gotten tired of showing what they found there. It just quietly goes into storage. But we have a new interest. John D. Rockefeller acquires, with Mr. Rorimer's strong encouragement, the Holy Grail. I do not know how many of you have ever noticed this piece. It is now in one of our regular cases. It is, in fact, a 6th century standing lamp. But the dealer who found it around 1900 pushed very hard, and at several World's Fairs, for this to be the Holy Grail, this piece up here, which was then put into a cage cup with the earliest images of Christ and Peter and Paul, and they're seated like classical philosophers in these bamboo or reed chairs, and they are published absolutely everywhere. And I would so like to tell you nobody cares about that anymore, but there was an exhibition on Byzantium at the Royal Academy in London just a few years ago, and I lent the Holy Grail to that exhibit, and I'm told that they believe a third of their outstanding attendance was based on people coming to see whether or not they thought they were looking at the Holy Grail. So still not Byzantium, but Byzantium's Holy Grail. What happens within the Met and within American scholarship is that this piece, which originally is shown in a room of its own at the cloisters, and then it's brought down to the Met as its connection with the legend of King Arthur gets less compelling. So if you look at old movies, when Paul Newman does the chalice, the Holy Grail, it looks like this. When Steven Spielberg does Raiders of the Lost Ark, he's really big into French Gothic, and there's nothing that looks like this. I am the only person that looked at the movie for what he thought was the Holy Grail. But what we do that is far more important and intellectual with it is that Kurt Weitzman, this great scholar at Princeton University, whom Thomas Hoving, our director, had done his dissertation with, is invited to do an exhibition, The Age of Spirituality, that explains, in Kurt Weitzman's opinion, how you move from the classical world with the classical theater, was borrowed from Tunisia, from Judaism in the region, this is our piece, to the Holy Grail, the Antioch chalice, to this huge paten from a church in northern Syria that is in Dumbarton Oaks. And then my favorite, this is one of a set of ivories that show you St. Paul in Alexandria, Egypt. We think of him as the patron saint of St. Mark. We think of St. Mark as the patron saint of Venice, but he is initially the bishop of Alexandria. And in this image, Mark has come to Alexandria to proselyte, and his sandal has broken, and the cobbler Ananias, in repairing his sandal, hurts his hand and curses, and Paul cures it, and it is his first miracle in Alexandria. Ananias becomes the second bishop. So you have this exquisitely carved ivory that relates to Mark before we think of Mark. And yet his very presence there is the reason the Coptic Church considers him their first bishop. And in 1997, and I mentioned that I was able to do an exhibition that went beyond the first great period of Byzantium to what I consider to be the second great period, and thus I called it the glory of Byzantium, the 9th to the 13th centuries. And you can see that as in all institutions, I borrow from what already exists. So I take the two copies from the 1944 exhibition. And this photograph that was in the exhibition shows you how far up they had to go, because they are from right here in the church. You can barely see them when you stand on the floor when you visit Istanbul. And I made those the great centerpiece of the entrance gallery. Now this is a centerpiece of the Benaki Museum in Athens, and this is on loan to a museum in Connecticut. The exhibition, The Glory of Byzantium, sought to explain that the empire was both a powerful secular state and a state that is represented by the Orthodox Church today. So we borrowed from our own collections a Morgan piece and the Giamatti enamels from Morgan, but we added from the treasury of San Marco in Venice this incredible gold and silver copy of a, I believe, Byzantine bathhouse. Bathhouses were very popular, and this teeny, it doesn't look teeny here, but it's the size of a thimble. It's incredibly ornate. It came from a private collection and is now in our collection, because the ideas that went with it led the owner to think that it should be available to the public. And we, in this slide, I've given you the Giamatti enamels as they were originally used, surrounding an icon that came to us from the Vatican, showing a military saint. And most importantly, in that period, we borrowed from the monastery of St. Catherine at Sinai, a site that what we brought to it was ideas. They have never lent since they were founded in the 4th century, and borrowing from them began a whole period of interconnections that continues till today. And that exhibition, since it drew nearly 500,000 visitors, encouraged the museum to think I should do another exhibition. So in 2004, I was able to do Byzantium, Faith and Power, where I was arguing that while the state from the second half of the 15th century till its fall was increasingly smaller and less important, intellectually it still had an incredible impact, and that much of that impact was lost because we'd forgotten that many of the works belong to that period. So it was kind of wonderful that the Greeks passed by with the torch going to the Olympics, an effort to remind everybody that the Olympics started in Greece, as I tried to make sure that you knew that the Sakos of Charlemagne in the Vatican treasury of St. Peter was not a work of the 8th century from Western Europe, but was in fact a 14th century work made for the Orthodox Church, an exceptional work of embroidery that's always denies the idea that there was no money in Byzantium at that date. And that while not everybody in the subsequent centuries thought everything that one might have thought of the empire when Justinian was the ruler, still the Italian artist Pisanello thought enough of the visit of the Emperor John VIII Palaeologus to the Council of Ferrero Florence in 1438-39 that he sketched him. These are the earliest surviving pages from an Italian artist's sketchbook. They are intensely studied by people interested in Italian art, but for us they were important because he was interested in the Byzantine emperor, even in a very reduced form in terms of power, and he identified him as the Byzantines identified themselves. He identified him as the emperor of the Romans. So you can see him front and on his horse and backwards. And this exhibition, too, extended through all sorts of images that went with the period. And one of my favorite galleries was filled with miniature mosaics. These are on the whole things you would hold in your hand to contemplate. They are made of little mosaic tesserae that, if you're lucky, are like a 1/16 of an inch high and wide. They come from roughly the year 1300. They suddenly appear, they're widely made. Everybody thinks they're the most wonderful thing in the world. Ivan the Terrible buys a whole pile of them when he becomes Tsar of Russia. The Renaissance is very excited over them. Everybody redates them to the 6th century so that they don't get any credit for the makers who made them. They get made antiquities. And we were able, through the gift of a collector who's actually more interested in Japanese art, to gain this one piece, the Virgin Eleusa, a work which in a 16th century Latin hand says on the back that this is the image that St. Catherine of Alexandria looked at that converted her from being a wealthy Roman virgin from the classical religious tradition to a Christian. So you are buying from a good dealer, a guaranteed piece, and I'm sure you're not too shocked to know that while it is older than the 16th century, it is not from the age of St. Catherine, who was martyred in the 4th century. It's roughly 1,000 years later. So the ability for dealers to somewhat mislead is not new to your generation of collecting and acquiring. It is a wonderful piece for us. And again, we borrowed from Sinai, and this time we focused on works like these that we know were connected to the Crusaders coming into the Eastern Mediterranean, bringing with them the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Benedictines, the Church of Rome, and creating a blend that we are only beginning to explore and more now that we no longer claim that everything Byzantine never ever saw anybody else's art. And that is a very big step forward that has occurred since 1997. In 2012, I was able to have an exhibition that looked at the centuries between the age of spirituality's ending and the Gloria Byzantium's revival. And that's a period when the Byzantine Empire goes through what is essentially a civil war. There is a great deal of debate over whether or not it is appropriate to venerate a religious image. We're not quite sure where they have these fights, but they definitely do have them. And certainly the emperor is opposed to images. And I sought to look at what happened in the areas that the empire loses in these centuries. So southern Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, this whole swath, which had produced emperors for the Romans of the classical age. Egypt was the breadbasket for Constantinople, and suddenly between the 7th and the 9th century, and essentially in the 7th century, it's lost. So I wanted to know what had happened to Memphis and Alexandria as presented on a floor from the town of Jaharis in Jordan, dug up by archaeologists from Yale University in those important early decades of the 20th century, put in storage at about the same time we put all of our questions about the origins of Christianity in storage, and restored for this exhibition, and now proudly on display in the wonderful new galleries of art at Yale University. So in a way, we're doing archaeology of collections. And in the show, what I did was to take you from the David plates, because an odd part of my collections at the Met is an awful lot of them, which are quite elegant, like the David plates, are in fact made during this period that the throwaway sentence is, the empire is dead. It's clearly not dead. What does happen is the taxes that you paid in Alexandria to Constantinople are now being paid to new Arab overlords in Constantinople is hurt by it. But it's not the death and destruction of ideas. So we brought together the mosaic pot at the top of the Jaharis mosaic, and we followed it as it became a variant on the pot and grapevines on the facade of one of the great palaces of the early Islamic world. And we followed these gentlemen, who look very much as you would think Romans should look, or Byzantines, to this gentleman, who looks like he's Dolly Parton, but who is in fact one of the first Abbasid rulers of the Eastern Mediterranean. He is sent from the new Abbasid capital in Baghdad to be the overlord of the Egyptian territories. And it turns out that his parents were bought in the slave market in Bukhara. So when he arrives to rule Cairo, which doesn't exist yet, he does not look like David or Goliath could have looked. He looks like something totally other. and it's in a way the beginning of the further separation of what we think of as Islamic art from its evolution to a great extent from the Byzantine tradition. And one of the things that continues between them that we're quite interested in is textiles. They're cheap to carry, they're cheap to sell, are very expensive, and the most expensive are silks. And what's fascinating about both of these pieces, one from the Met and one that we borrowed from Europe, is we don't think anymore that they were woven in the Byzantine period. They are Byzantine style woven in the Islamic era. And it shows what a well-bred gentleman, those of you who are here, would want to do on your estates in the country. You would want to ride your elegant horses and hunt with your falcons, and here are your lures to call them back. And then there's this whole enthusiasm for sport we don't do anymore, where you go into the marshes and with spears you kill cranes. But it's so popular that there are poems on the joys of going and doing this. These shows, which are a place like the shows here at Rollins, that you pull together an idea, feed back into the galleries of Byzantine art that you can come visit now at the museum. They are an accumulation of collectors, curators, evolving ideas that are now focused on giving you a sense of the world that created this empire of the Romans, rule from Constantinople and its border peoples and its connections with the Latin West, including French Gothic, which it does have a major influence on, but also its connections with the Islamic world, which it also has a major influence on. So you come into our galleries, which is everything under and around our great stairs at the Met, and you see the secular world on one side, a world where you're still reading Homer, where you're educated in a classical mode, where women are educated, and when you want to go to work for the government, you take exams. And as you go down the corridor, you go through the crypt, which we opened in 2000, which used to just be the underside of the great stairs, and you pass through both the secular and the religious world of Byzantine Egypt. And so you can find Mr. Morgan's bling, you can find the stones that were in the galleries in 1910, and you can find in this area and out towards you a whole rotation that's regularly changing of textiles. And when you come out on the other side, you go back to where we started at the Met. You're looking at the origins of the visual voice of Christianity and Judaism. You're looking at the piece from 1877, but now I've got the type of tabletop that was on top of it so that you can see on the diagram how they went together. We still have the sarcophagus of a physician and this fragment that show you how scholars were shown and monuments related to their death. We have a case now of works of Judaica, including here, and I still cannot manage to display it so that people see it well. If I flip it over, you see the image better, but then I get letters about the Latin is backwards. So I keep trying. And then we have what we've never really had before, a little bit on the church in Rome, old Rome, the Rome that we associate with St. Peter, the Church of St. Peter, Pope Francis now. We have this piece, these two, and this is a case of gold glass from there. And this piece is my first acquisition for the Met, a generous gift of a man, Joseph Middleman, who had bought an estate on Cold Spring Harbor, and as he was stripping it of everything out in the gardens that wasn't useful to his plans, he found this, and as a student at Brandeis, he was certain that this was genuine and not a garden fake. And he tried to get a number of museums interested in it, and all of them knew that Christ with a beard never appears on works of what this had to be a 4th century work if it was genuine. Mr. Middleman was particularly proud of that beard, and even more proud of that beard was the man who brought it to America, Walter Jennings, a Rockefeller relative who collected, according to his grandchildren, images of George Washington and of Christ. And so he had bought this early 4th century sarcophagus carved in the era of Constantine the Great from a garden in Rome, brought it to his estate on Cold Spring Harbor, was all excited over the fact that Christ had a beard. Like we all know Christ really looked, because Van Eyck painted him that way 1,500 years after he died, but that's a small problem. And what is important about this and makes it worth having in our galleries is it's the beginning of the claim of the church in Rome of the significance of St. Peter, and that the fact that Peter is buried in Rome, that the man upon whose rock Christ was going to build his church should be associated with Rome, not the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean that we know he preached in. So what you actually have at this inn that are complete is Peter in a jail cell, Peter being arrested. From here to here is all carved about 1912. This part is genuine. So I've published articles on the genuine part, and I've published articles on the restoration parts. They all help us expand, explaining what makes the church in Italy move away from what the church is doing in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in 2008, I was able to expand that further because the Jaharises enabled us to build a Byzantine apse. And the monks at Sinai told me that if I made the separation of the templon for the Orthodox iconostasis wide enough, it would be fine because women could go through it because it wasn't quite right. But you are seeing a whole series of images that now are positioned for being icons. And the most important is the Jaharis lectionary, a work that was made for Hagia Sophia that they bought for us, the Eleusa icon, the Bliss icon, and another icon acquired for the study of arms and armor. And we expand our interests so that by getting a Byzantine earring, these Russian ones make sense. The Ethiopian manuscript shows the Ethiopian connection to its conversion from the Eastern Mediterranean. The Armenian pieces we're acquiring now extend that further, so that when you come to the Met, you're looking at a totality of the voice of these people and how they influence others. Thank you.